Friary was where friars lived. There was an open quadrangle at the centre, the heart of the place, the cloister, and around this was a covered walkway on the four sides, and then the buildings were around those four sides of the cloister. They each had their own specific function, the most important being the church, which was usually on either the north or, as in the case of Blackfriary, the south side of the cloister. And then the other buildings had their own functions that were well understood, so somebody coming from Spain to Blackfriary would have known exactly where everything was. Here we also have a second cloister or courtyard to the north of the first, but we've barely touched on that in excavations. So as we're going through what we've found in the excavations around the site, we'll talk about the different functions of the different buildings. The most important room in the East Range was what was called the chapter house, and this was where the friars met every day and they would read a chapter of their rule, hence the name. They would also decide on the business, and they would also take down the Book of Obits, which would tell them who they had to pray for, who had left money in their wills for candles to be lit or prayers to be said or masses to be said. Once a week they would confess their sins to each other. North of the chapter house was a room where we believe we have the remains of a fireplace. Now this, its technical term, the calefactory, would have been the warming room or a parlour. A room where the friars could come and warm themselves because it would have been the only fireplace, apart obviously from the kitchens. They were denying themselves worldly comforts. And we know that also near that space we have found stairs, which would be the day stairs. The stairs that were used to access the dormitories, which were overhead. Now, the friars at the beginning slept in one big room, the dormitory. The prior may have had his own apartment, but subsequently they were allowed to partition this space into individual cubicles, which were also used for study. But the principal point of interest with the dormitories and their position was that it meant that you could access from the dormitory the church at night through what was called the night stairs, which would have been against the bell tower or by the bell tower. And there the friars would go every night to say divine office during the night and first thing at the morning. We found a further space, again north of the chapter house. And this is of interest because concentrated in this area, beneath the rubble of the demolition phase, were a number of objects which relate very strongly to books. Book clasps, objects which could have been used for marking parchment, and other implements like that. And this has led us to conclude that this space, while perhaps not a formal scriptorium, may have functioned as a form of book room, study space, classroom, or something of that sort. We don't know whether it would have been single story or two-story. Both it and the chapter house project beyond the main line of the East Range, suggesting in the case of the chapter house that there was a later extension, possibly in the late 14th, early 15th century, as it is the only place from which we've recovered floor tiles, and they're of that date, suggesting that the floor was recovered in tiles at that point. There may also have been a stained glass window there. And the book room or scriptorium seems to have been a somewhat later addition, again to serve a function relating to books. During the course of excavating the extension to the chapter house and the scriptorium, we realised that this had also meant changing the previously existing drainage system. So obviously when the East Range was built, with the scale of the roofs and so on, you need to manage the rainwater. There were latrines that needed a fresh water supply to keep them flushed, and any water like that would have been channeled out into the gardens. And we discovered a rather elaborate drainage system which had to be reconfigured when these buildings were extended. We got environmental samples from both some of the drains and the kiln, and we were able to date some of the material. And in both instances, the dates came back to mid to late 13th century, representing activity at the very early stages of the Friary. So it was very nice to have confirmation of that sequence. So I'm here outside the East Range, just to the east of it, and we discovered in the course of our excavations that there are a series of features which are actually part of the earliest existence of the Friary itself. One of them is this corn drying kiln. Now it's really the last remnants of this corn drying kiln. Grain was dried before being ground because it was often too wet given the Irish climate. And this would have been part of such a structure where there would have been a fire bowl somewhere out here, a flue, and an area where the grain itself was, and the smoke and heat from the fire dried it. And very often these kilns went on fire and the grain charred, and they just left it. And we can see some of the remnants of the charred grain here. Now the entire area here was covered with charred grain, possibly from the last firing of the kiln, so they weren't too worried about cleaning it out. And we have recovered through excavation a huge quantity of this grain, and it proved that there was wheat and there was barley and oats in the mix. And grain like that would have been a staple of the friars' diet. I'm standing outside the North Range, within what we know is the second courtyard. And there's part of the original surface of the walkway between these two walls, and this was a yard at the back of the North Range. And we know that the buildings continued to the north here in another quadrangle. However, the North Range itself behind me, we know was the kitchen range. That would be typical because it would be across from the church, but also if we turn and look at this section face here, we have excavated down through all this material, and what we found was successive layers underneath the thin lens of rubble at the top, but successive layers containing animal bone, shell, broken pottery, all the kind of material that would have been waste from the kitchen. And what's remarkable, in fact, is that as we go from top to bottom, we're travelling down through time as the character and proportions of the pottery particularly, which are diagnostic, change, so that the bulk of the medieval pottery is in the lower layers, and as we go up, the bulk of the pottery is actually post-medieval. We know that at the time of the dissolution, that this place, the Friary, was sold off and given to a farmer, and it's actually very likely that that farmer moved in to the North Range, which after all would have had the kitchens, and that he reconfigured the entire place into a farmyard, and that some of the post-medieval waste that we're seeing is actually from the time of that occupation. We also suspect that he in fact reconfigured the building, making the rooms slightly smaller. Perhaps they were very dilapidated. I'm standing here in the West Range, but as you can see, I'm actually down in a ditch. So we found out last year, much to our surprise, as I said before, that we have a series of ditches underneath the footprint of the Friary, and I'm standing in one of those ditches. And I have a wall here to one side of me, which would have been the west wall of the North Range, and this would have been a wall for a room within the West Range, because we're actually at the junction of the two, North Range, West Range. And there was a possible floor surface here. Behind me you can see all the rubble that we've had to excavate through. But this, however, is no ordinary rubble, because out of this area came a vast quantity of stained glass. And we realised that what had happened back in the 18th century was that when the guys were demolishing the Friary, they took the leaded windows from the different parts, the church, the chapter house, brought it over here and smashed out the glass and took away the lead, and they left this great dump of stained glass in this area. So in order for them, going back to the original builders of the Friary, in order for them to stabilise the buildings, they had to ensure that they made sure that the walls did not subside. So while one course of foundation stones was enough here they had to put in a second course to stabilise the fill underneath, from the underlying ditch.